Hey guys, tonight we return to a story that is both beautiful and sorrowful. A story whose pain still echoes across 500 years of history. Imagine this. You are just 11 years old. Your forehead is pressed against a cold stone wall in a silent fortress. Behind the wooden door, your mother's screams rise and fall, each wave weaker than the last, until suddenly, all goes quiet. You have no idea what is happening. You are not allowed inside. All you can do is stand there, trembling, and listen as she is swallowed by agony. And you don't know that this will be the last time you ever hear her voice. That child was Henry the Boy, who would later become Henry VIII, the infamous king known for 6 wives, for violence, for a bottomless loneliness. But in that moment he was just a boy, losing the only person who ever held him with unconditional love. Queen Elizabeth of York. Her death was not just a private tragedy within a royal family. It was the very first crack in the soul of a child who would one day become the harshest king England had ever seen. A wound so deep that for the rest of his life, no matter how many crowns he wore, Henry would keep searching in other women for one thing: the feeling of being loved like he was as a child. This is the story of a woman who ended a war through marriage, yet could not save herself from a cruel fate: a mother, a queen, and the last person who ever saw the vulnerable side of a tyrant. Before we begin, if you love history, if you love stories told in this soft, gentle way, go ahead and gently tap, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy it. And let me know, where are you watching from? What time is it there right now? It warms my heart knowing this story is being heard all around the world at night, in silence, perhaps while you are alone. Now, dim the lights, lower the volume, take a deep breath, and let's begin. And that is where the story truly begins. On a cold night inside the tower, where a mother slipped quietly out of this world, and a child began to carry a wound that would never heal. Elizabeth of York was dying in the same fortress where her 2 younger brothers had disappeared 20 years earlier. Not far from that room, 11-year-old Henry pressed his face against the cold stone wall, listening to his mother's groans without understanding that he was about to lose the only person who ever loved him unconditionally. He was not allowed inside. No one explained anything. There were only sounds of agony rising and falling like waves, then fading into silence. He could only tremble, lean his forehead against the stone, and listen as his mother, the Queen of England, slowly slipped away. Just a short time before, Elizabeth had given birth to her 7th child, a tiny baby girl named Catherine. The infant lived only 9 days. On the 10th day, candles were lit, the shroud was brought. They said, God has called her home. But perhaps Elizabeth's heart broke, along with her baby's passing. She began to fade, struck by postpartum infection, a deadly illness in the 16th century, with no cure. For almost 10 days, she fought in pain, right there in the same fortress where her brothers Edward and Richard had vanished without a trace 20 years earlier. Elizabeth died on the 11th of February, year 1503, her 37th birthday. Her death was not just a loss for the Tudor family, it became the seed of a historical wound. The woman who united 2 warring houses died in isolation, carrying with her secrets no one could ever piece together again. But to understand why the word mystery forever trails the name Elizabeth of York, we must start from the beginning, when she was still a princess, born on the 11th of February, year 1466, at Westminster Palace. At that time, her father, King Edward IV, had just reclaimed the throne after years of civil war. She was not born into peace, but into a kingdom soaked in blood horse, hooves on mud, arrows in the sky, and roses used not for weddings, but to mark the dead. They said she was the child of destiny, the one who could end the Wars of the Roses, the brutal conflict between the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster that had torn England apart for more than 30 years. Yet Elizabeth's childhood was no fairy tale. When she was just 3 years old, her uncle George, Duke of Clarence, was executed for treason, drowned in a vat of wine. At the age of 5, her grandfather was captured by enemies, beheaded, and his head displayed on a spike. And when she was 7, her mother fled with her children into the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, carrying jewels and treasure, while armies roared outside the city gates. The abbey became Elizabeth's shelter many times, a holy place where even kings were forbidden to enter. But it was also where she learned the most brutal lesson of her life. Nowhere is truly safe. She realized early that crowns could vanish overnight, that oaths meant little, and that friends could become enemies in the blink of an eye. She became skilled at listening to whispers, memorizing threats behind smiling faces. She trusted no one fully, but never let anyone know she was watching. That is how a child learns to survive in an unforgiving world. Those are the roots that formed the Elizabeth of York, who would one day marry the enemy of her bloodline to save a nation, but would carry her own grief in silence, never revealing the truth about her brother's fate. And from those same childhood lessons, she would later teach her son, Henry VIII, never trust in promises. Trust in power. Only power can keep you alive. Elizabeth of York was born on the 11th of February, year 1466, at Westminster Palace. Her father, King Edward IV, had just reclaimed the throne after years of civil war, and her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was the most hated queen in England. But this baby girl carried something that the entire nation longed for: the potential to end 30 years of bloodshed between the houses of York, the White Rose, and Lancaster, the Red Rose. From the moment she opened her eyes, her life was never peaceful. Elizabeth did not grow up in fairy tales. She grew up as a pawn on a bloody chessboard. Winchester, Greenwich, Westminster. Those were not just palaces, they were battlegrounds of power. She was constantly moved, constantly guarded, constantly taught that danger was always near. And the enemies were not just in stories, they were family, they were nobles. They were men who smiled in the court one day and raised swords the next. When she was 3 years old, she heard the whispers. Her uncle, George, Duke of Clarence, had been convicted of treason and executed, drowned in a vat of wine. At the age of 5, her grandfather was captured by the enemy, beheaded, and his head was placed on a spike for all to see. Can you imagine being 5 years old, hearing that your grandfather's severed head was rotting in the open air outside the city walls? By the age of 7, things became even more terrifying. Her mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, grabbed jewels, gold, and her children, fleeing into the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey to seek refuge. Outside the stone walls, London was under siege. Armies marched, swords clashed, blood stained the ground. Inside, the future queen slept on cold stone floors, ate whatever scraps strangers brought in, and learned to stay silent while listening for footsteps, not knowing whether they belonged to protectors or executioners. Then came the year 1470, the darkest year of her childhood. Her father, King Edward IV, was driven from the throne. The enemy took the city. 4-year-old Elizabeth was trapped once again behind the stone walls of the Abbey, a sacred place that was meant to offer sanctuary, and yet became a prison of fear. For months she lived in cold and hunger, her days filled with prayer and tremors every time a sword clanged outside the doors. And it was within those stone walls that something else happened, something that would haunt English history forever. On the 2nd of November, year 1470, her baby brother, Edward, was born inside the abbey. That tiny baby would grow up to become Edward V, one of the 2 princes in the tower. The world did not know it yet, but both boys would later disappear without a trace, triggering one of the greatest mysteries of royal history. The experience of hiding, starving, and sleeping on frozen stones at such a young age carved something permanent into Elizabeth's soul. Scholars believe that these months inside Westminster Abbey planted a deep-rooted fear of instability and betrayal in her mind, a fear she carried throughout her life. She learned that walls could protect you, but they could also trap you. That safety was never guaranteed, that the world could take everything from you in a single storm. Later, as a mother, she would pass this unspoken lesson on to her son, Prince Henry, the boy who would grow into Henry VIII. She would teach him that the world is always hungry, that power is the only shield that lasts, that even royal blood, even holy oaths, mean nothing when ambition walks in the dark. And Henry listened, but he listened too well. 9 months later, Elizabeth's father reclaimed the throne, and the family returned to their palace, but the little princess was no longer the same. She now understood that crowns could turn to dust overnight, that those who smiled at you might soon be holding a dagger, and that survival was not a matter of birthright, it was a matter of intelligence. She was taught to read and write, to speak French and Latin, to sew delicate embroidery, to dance with grace. But her true education was the court itself. Every day she watched her father, a handsome and charismatic king, capable of great charm but also ruthless force when necessary. And she watched her mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of ambition and steel, whose every decision was driven by one concern: the survival of her children. From them, young Elizabeth learned not just languages or needlework, but the art of reading a room. She learned to watch eyes instead of mouths, to catch secrets whispered behind fans, to curve her lips into a gentle smile, while tucking every threat into the back of her mind like hidden knives. Years passed. Elizabeth grew into a graceful young woman, but beneath the silk and jewels was someone shaped by war, betrayal, and fear. This education was no accident. Her family's survival depended on her ability to play roles flawlessly. Then came the day that tested everything she had learned. On the 9th of April, year 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly at the age of 40. Elizabeth was 17. The grief was immediate, but the danger was faster. Her 12-year-old brother became King Edward V. By law and tradition, a boy king should be protected until he comes of age. That role fell to his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man known for his loyalty on the battlefield, a man who had fought for Edward IV for many years. At first, Richard appeared trustworthy. But appearances crumble quickly in royal corridors. Within weeks, trust shattered. Richard intercepted the young king on his way to London. He arrested Edward's companions, Elizabeth's uncle and half-brother, and confiscated their power. Then he turned toward the Queen, demanding she hand over the 9-year-old Prince Elizabeth's younger brother, also named Richard. Queen Elizabeth Woodville hesitated. She had seen her husband betrayed, her children threatened, her family destroyed once before. She sensed something terrible was unfolding. There was no victory to be won in confronting Richard. There was only one move left, the move she had made once already: run. So once again, she gathered her daughters, her jewels, and her dignity, and fled to the only place kings dared not trespass: sanctuary, Westminster Abbey. It was the second time this sacred escape was used. The second time the royal women became refugees within holy walls, protected only by religion and stone. Yet this time, the air was heavier. The walls felt closer. The whisper of danger, darker. 10 years earlier, the sanctuary had protected Elizabeth as a frightened child. Now, at 17, she returned as a young woman, but she was not any safer. The stakes were higher. If the women didn't escape fast enough, their future might be decided by a man who now held all the power and who would soon take more. They waited in the dark halls of the abbey, candles trembling in cold air. Outside, Richard's soldiers surrounded the walls. He demanded the younger prince. He reminded everyone of his legal authority. And he made promises, holy promises, that no harm would come to the two boys. But Elizabeth, the 17-year-old princess, perhaps already knew. Words, like crowns, can break silently. No one outside the abbey could see her face then. Yet imagination paints it clearly. A girl who had spent her whole life learning to read danger now, watching it move toward her family like a shadow, relentless and cold. The walls of the abbey trembled once again, and the story that would haunt all of England for centuries had just begun. Richard surrounded the abbey with armed guards, declaring that he only wanted to protect the two princes and bring them to the Tower of London to await the coronation. For the Tower was not only a prison, but also a royal residence and fortress. Before the crowd, he swore a solemn oath upon holy relics, promising no harm would come to his young nephews. Hungry, isolated, and exhausted after months in sanctuary, Elizabeth's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, had no choice. At last, she placed her trust in the oath of a man she already feared, and she handed over her 9-year-old son. But Richard did not waste time. Almost immediately, he detonated the political bomb that would shake England to its core. He declared that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. By this declaration, all of their children, including Princess Elizabeth, were not legitimate. They were bastards. They had no right to the throne. With one proclamation, Richard erased an entire branch of the royal bloodline. He then crowned himself as King Richard III, and the two princes, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9, were taken to the Tower of London, as promised. Only, they never re-emerged. There was no funeral, no royal decree of death, no explanation. One day, they were seen playing in the palace gardens. Then silence. Time passed. Rumours gathered like storm clouds. The whispers grew darker. Richard killed them. Richard murdered children for the crown. Everyone at court understood what had happened, though no one dared say it aloud. The tower, once a symbol of royal strength, now loomed as a tomb of secrets. History would later call them the princes in the tower, two young boys swallowed by stone walls and ambition. For Elizabeth, this was the moment the sanctuary turned poisonous. The abbey, once a sacred refuge, now a silent witness to betrayal. She realized, with devastating clarity, that words meant nothing. Oaths were wind. Even the sacred promise of a king could be snapped like a twig underfoot. There was only one law that seemed to hold: power. And power had just executed her brothers in silence. Something changed inside her that day. The young woman who had once memorized smiles and curtsies now began watching for knives behind them. The world no longer divided into good and bad, trustworthy and treacherous. It divided into who has power and who does not. Standing in that cold, echoing sanctuary, Elizabeth faced two choices. Choice 1. Accept her new fate as a bastard niece, stripped of title and hope. Live quietly. Marry some minor noble. Disappear into history as a footnote. Choice 2. Do the unthinkable: join hands with the ancient enemies of her house, the Lancastrians, and help topple the man who had murdered her brothers. Elizabeth chose the second. It was not a choice made from romance or idealism. It was born of fury, of outrage, of a vow whispered through tears. If Richard would break every sacred bond to seize the crown, then she would break the walls between families to avenge her blood. Beside her, her mother made the same choice. And so began the quietest, boldest conspiracy of the century, not by kings or generals, but by two women with everything to lose. A mother and her daughter, alone in sanctuary, crafting plans in the darkness to unite with Henry Tudor, the last male Lancaster heir, a stranger in exile, a man without lands or army, who had fled England 14 years earlier. This alliance would not be safe. It would not be guaranteed. But it was the only chance. Elizabeth did not choose survival. She chose revenge and the future. She was ready to gamble her title, her fate, perhaps her life, on the hope that one day the man who stole everything from her would feel what her brothers had felt in the tower: fear in the dark. And in that moment, the destiny of England shifted quietly, forever. To avenge the deaths of her brothers and bring an end to the Wars of the Roses, Elizabeth of York would have to do something no one could have imagined: marry Henry Tudor, a man she had never met, a man whose family had spent decades spilling York blood across English soil. By birth, by history, by honour, he should have been her enemy. But in the realm of power, love and hatred are luxuries. Survival demands something colder. On paper, Henry Tudor barely had a claim to the crown of England at all. He was the last male heir of the House of Lancaster, but only through a weak maternal line. His father, Edmund Tudor, had died before Henry was born, and Henry himself had spent 14 years in exile, penniless, landless, wandering from Brittany to France with nothing but borrowed support and a name that meant little outside titles and hope. Yet in the bloody Game of Thrones, he held one priceless advantage: he was alive. Every other Lancaster male had died by sword or axe. Henry was the last red rose left standing, and that made him dangerous not because of what he had, but because of what he could become. So, in the shadows of sanctuaries and shuttered chambers, two mothers began plotting Elizabeth Woodville, mother of Elizabeth of York, and Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor. They could not meet openly. They could not write in their own hands. So they entrusted their secrets to a Welsh physician named Lewis Caerleon, a quiet man with access to courts and sick rooms alike. Through him, messages passed, sealed in wax, carried across borders, hidden inside shoes and garments. The plan, once whispered in the dark, was breathtaking in its audacity. If Henry Tudor could defeat Richard III and claim the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York. The white rose and the red rose would become one. Their children would carry both bloodlines, and England's 30-year nightmare would finally end. But whispers do not win battles. Promises do not sway swords. Henry needed more than a plan. He needed something that crowned him in people's hearts, long before he ever set foot on English soil. So, on Christmas Day, year 1483, Inside the Cathedral of Rennes in France, Henry stood before a crowd of supporters. French lords, Welsh exiles, English rebels, and swore a public vow. "Once I am King of England, I shall take Elizabeth of York as my wife." It was not just a marriage proposal, it was a proclamation of destiny, a banner to rally under, a bond of blood between two warring houses. Yet, even as Henry made this vow in safety, the woman he pledged himself to was still trapped, held under close watch by the man who had stolen her brothers and crowned himself king. Richard III controlled her movements, her access to letters, even her food. For months he cut off supplies to Westminster Abbey, hoping hunger and fear would force the York women out. Eventually it did. Elizabeth and her sisters were brought back to court, but not to freedom. That was when Elizabeth began performing the most dangerous role of her life. She walked into Richard's court as if nothing had happened. She smiled. She bowed. She accepted jewels, dresses, honours. She behaved exactly as the king wanted, a grateful niece, humbled by his mercy, obedient to his authority. But every curtsy was a blade. Every smile was a mask. She knew the halls she walked through were soaked in the blood of her brothers. She knew the man who called her dear niece might one day try to make her his queen or disappear her if she defied him. But she also knew that Henry Tudor was coming. Somewhere across the Channel, a man she had never seen was raising banners and armies in her name. So Elizabeth did what she had been trained to do since childhood. She watched, waited, and memorized everything. Which lords were loyal out of fear, and which out of ambition. Which households quietly toasted the memory of Edward V. Which knights grew restless at the thought of a king who might have murdered boys. She played the court like a chessboard, and she was the quietest piece but also the most dangerous. Outside, England still whispered about the vanished princes. Inside, Elizabeth of York learned to breathe through silk and lies, searching for a crack in the walls of Richard's fortress. Her whole life had led her to this moment, a moment where she would either bend or break, submit or survive. And in those glittering halls, surrounded by her brother's killer and his uneasy allies, Elizabeth made her choice. She would not break. She would wait. She would strike. Her silence was not surrender. It was the sharpest weapon she possessed. Back at Richard III's court, 18-year-old Elizabeth of York stepped once more into the palace that had belonged to her father, now taken by the uncle whose hands were stained with her family's blood. On the surface, she smiled sweetly and thanked him for the honour of bringing her back. But on the inside, she was a grieving sister, forced to dine beside the man suspected of murdering her brothers. Richard treated her with surprising generosity. Too much generosity. He gave her elegant gowns, jewels, a place of honour beside his queen, Anne Neville. It was all too visible and too deliberate, and soon people began to whisper. During Christmas festivities in the year 1484, Elizabeth appeared wearing a gown almost identical to Queen Anne's, rich crimson and gold, threaded with pearls. The resemblance was intentional, or worse, meaningful. Courtiers exchanged glances. Servants murmured behind tapestries. Could it be that Richard viewed his niece as something more than a dependent? As a replacement? The rumours multiplied like shadows. Queen Anne was ill. Very ill. She had grown thin, pale, too weak to appear in public long, and all eyes watched Richard with growing unease. If Anne died, what would he do? Would he do the unthinkable? Would he marry his brother's daughter? In medieval Europe, to marry one's niece, the daughter of one's own brother, was considered incest, a grotesque violation of both church law and natural order. But Richard was desperate. His only legitimate child, Edward of Middleham, had died the previous year, in 1484. Without a son, Richard had no heir. His grip on the throne was shaky. And what better way to secure it than by marrying a young, beautiful woman who represented the purest York blood? Elizabeth was perfect. She was the eldest daughter of Edward IV. She was beloved by the York supporters. She was politically priceless. If she married Richard and bore him sons, the crown would be secure, and every accusation against him would lose its teeth. Queen Anne Neville, though bedridden, saw the danger long before others dared to speak. She saw how Richard's eyes lingered too long on Elizabeth. She felt how his favour shifted. She understood, perhaps, better than anyone, that she was not just dying, she was being replaced. Then came the date that burned itself into suspicion. The 16th of March, year 1485. Queen Anne Neville died. The official cause? Illness. But the court was not convinced. Some whispered poison, others said grief. Many wondered whether her death had been helped along by the man who now stood beside her empty throne, wearing a mask of solemn mourning while perhaps already imagining his next wedding. Elizabeth remained silent but watched everything. Watched the way Richard greeted the nobles. Watched the glances exchanged between advisors. Watched how some men already shifted in their allegiance, sensing a new queen on the horizon. The rumours became so loud that even Richard felt the pressure. He issued a public denial stating that he had never nor would ever seek Elizabeth's hand in marriage. But the denial fell flat. Everyone knew a king in need of an heir cannot remain unmarried. And behind her quiet gaze, Elizabeth pieced together something far more horrifying than any court gossip. What if Richard had not murdered her brothers simply for the crown? What if he had killed them, to clear the path to marry her? It was a thought so monstrous that even Elizabeth herself could barely face it. Yet once seen, it could not be unseen. Her fear hardened into hatred, and her hatred became a vow. If Henry Tudor landed in England, she would do everything in her power to help him destroy Richard no matter the cost. Even if it meant offering her hand to a stranger, even if it meant living the rest of her life as a political symbol, not a woman. But she also knew this. One wrong word, one wrong look, and she would vanish just as silently as Edward and Richard had vanished into the tower. So she smiled. She curtsied. She played her part. And in the shadows of a stolen throne, Elizabeth of York prepared herself for war. In the summer of year 1485, word spread through the court like wildfire. Henry Tudor was gathering an army in France and preparing to invade England to seize the throne. Richard III understood immediately what this meant, the final gamble of a desperate rival. And Richard also understood something else. Elizabeth of York, once seemingly compliant, was no longer someone he could trust. She had become dangerous. So, cloaked in the language of protection, Richard sent Elizabeth, her sisters, and other female relatives northward to Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire. On parchment, it was a gesture of safety, removing them from the chaos of impending war. In truth, it was imprisonment, a gilded cage. Richard severed their access to communication, isolated them from potential alliances, and ensured the most valuable woman in England would not be within reach of those who might rescue her. But Richard had misjudged one crucial detail. He was too late. During her months at court, Elizabeth had not simply endured her uncle's presence. She had observed. Quietly, patiently. She watched which nobles bowed too deeply. Which ones hesitated when they said, "Long live the king," which looked over their shoulder before toasting. Elizabeth had been gathering her own intelligence long before Sheriff Hutton's walls closed around her. And now her observations were about to matter. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor set his plans into motion. On the 7th of August, year 1485, he landed at Milford Haven in Wales with approximately 2,000 men, most of them French mercenaries, few of them seasoned, and almost none having ever set foot in England. On paper, this was not an army meant to win a throne. It was a death sentence. Richard III commanded perhaps 8,000 greater forces, well-armed, experienced in battle, and with strategic positions across the country. Henry was marching into disaster, yet men began joining him. Farmers, knights, exiled lords. Not hundreds of thousands, just enough to become a whisper in Richard's ear, a tremor across his battlefield. And they came not because Henry Tudor was beloved. They came because he had promised to marry Elizabeth of York. That single promise created something England had not known for 30 years' hope. If Henry won, the houses of York and Lancaster would be united. The white rose and the red rose would finally grow from the same stem. And for weary, blood-soaked England, the idea of peace was stronger than any sword. Richard realized this too late. In Sheriff Hutton, Elizabeth paced stone corridors, unable to act, unable to send messages, but listening for news. And while she waited, Richard made his final fatal error. He wrote to Elizabeth, "We do not have the letter, only the whispers of its contents. But every account agrees on the same point. Richard offered to marry her immediately if she would publicly renounce Henry Tudor and declare Richard the rightful king. It was the most desperate move of his reign. If Elizabeth had accepted, Henry's rebellion would have dissolved. His men would have deserted. His foreign mercenaries would have been slaughtered. His name would have vanished from history like a candle in the rain. Elizabeth knew this, and Elizabeth said no. A single word, spoken in silence, sealed the fate of two men and an entire kingdom. This was not a romantic gesture. She had never seen Henry. She did not know his voice or face. But she knew this. Richard killed her brothers. Richard stained the York name. Richard would consume her, body and legacy, if she let him. So she gambled everything. Her life, her lineage, her unknown future on the exiled stranger across the sea. Henry Tudor marched forward, not knowing whether Elizabeth had chosen him or betrayed him. Elizabeth of York did not ride into battle. She did not lead armies. But in that moment, locked behind stone walls, she wielded the most powerful weapon she possessed. Her choice. And the fate of England trembled on its silent edge. The two armies met at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, year 1485. Richard III held the high ground. His forces were larger, hardened, seasoned in warfare. Henry Tudor, by contrast, arrived with fewer than 5,000 men, many of them French mercenaries, and not a single battle victory to his name. He was a 30-year-old exile returning after 14 years abroad, gambling everything on a single throw of fate. But battles are not always won by strength sometimes. They turn on a whisper. For both armies were watched by a third force, the Stanley family. The Stanleys were no ordinary nobles. They commanded thousands of soldiers. They had the power to tilt the battle either way, and everyone knew it. Only, as the sun rose over Bosworth, the Stanleys stayed back, watching. Why did they wait? Because they understood the unspoken truth of English kingship. The crown does not belong to the strongest. It belongs to the most legitimate. And what made a man legitimate in this moment? One thing. Elizabeth of York. If she stood behind Richard, he remained king. If she married Henry, even this battered, exiled Henry, his line would unite the roses and close the wounds of war. The Stanleys watched the horizon and waited for a signal, not from Henry, not from Richard, but from history. And history whispered through Elizabeth's silent refusal to marry Richard. That refusal had meaning. It meant she had cast her lot with Henry Tudor. So when the battle raged and swords clashed, and when Henry's men began to falter under the weight of Richard's cavalry, the Stanleys made their choice. They charged, not toward Henry but against Richard. A thundering wall of spears and hooves struck the Plantagenet king from behind. Richard's lines broke. The field became chaos. Seeing his fate closing in, Richard III made a final, desperate choice. He did not retreat. He did not hide. He spurred his horse and charged directly toward Henry Tudor, sword raised, screaming his oath. Treason! Treason! He cut down Henry's standard-bearer. He came within yards of Henry himself. For a few breaths, perhaps fewer than 10, England hung in the balance. If Richard had reached Henry, if he had killed him with a single stroke, the uprising would have ended. The York crown secured. The Tudor dream smothered in its cradle. But before the blade could fall, Sir William Stanley's men surrounded Richard. They cut him down in the mud, his armour dented, his helmet torn away. The last Plantagenet king died face down in wet earth, his crown rolling into a patch of thorn bushes. The crown, the literal metal crown, was found there moments later. Dented, abandoned. Henry Tudor picked it up. And in that moment, on that field, he became King Henry VII, not by birth, not by lineage, but by the gamble that Elizabeth of York set in motion the day she said no to Richard. At Sheriff Hutton, word reached Elizabeth. Richard was dead. Henry had won. The man she had never met was now the King of England because of her decision. What did she feel? Not love. How could she love a stranger? But something like relief. In a world where promises had meant nothing, where her brothers died under oaths, and oaths protected murderers, Henry had kept his word. He had stood in Wren Cathedral and sworn publicly that he would marry her if he took the crown. And then he risked his life to make it so. That was no small thing. So in her quiet chamber, Elizabeth of York allowed herself a small, careful hope. Perhaps this marriage would not be love, but it might be something rarer: trust. She did not yet know that Henry was about to break that trust. Not with violence, not with cruelty, but with silence. And history would soon discover, sometimes, the coldest betrayal is simply being left waiting. Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII at Westminster Abbey. The crown was placed on his head on the 30th of October, year 1485. Trumpets sounded. Crowds roared. Banners bearing the newly designed Tudor rose half white, half red, waved like the promise of peace. Elizabeth stood perhaps not far away, watching, waiting, believing that soon, as promised, she would be crowned beside him as queen, as partner, as the bridge uniting two blood-soaked houses. But when the golden canopy was lifted and the crown descended, Henry stood alone. Elizabeth was not called forward. She was not crowned. She sat among the nobles, silent, neither princess nor queen, just waiting. It was the first shadow over their union. Henry delayed the marriage not for lack of interest, but out of political calculation. He knew what every whisper in England would say if he married her too soon. He only has the throne because of her. He is king through the House of York, not above it. That was the one thing Henry could not allow. He needed to be king by right of conquest. A sovereign not because he married a York princess, but because he defeated a usurper on the battlefield. So he waited. For 3 months, he left Elizabeth in limbo, neither exalted nor forgotten, but placed carefully in the uncertain space between future queen and political pawn. The woman he had promised to marry, whose family's support secured his victory, now became a risk to his authority if handled incorrectly. He waited until Parliament recognized him as king by just title of conquest. Then, and only then, did he make his next move. The church sent word. A papal dispensation had been granted. Because Henry and Elizabeth were distant cousins, both descended from King Edward III, they required special permission to Wednesday. Only then, with every legal stone in place, did Henry Tudor come to Elizabeth of York and make good on his oath. On the 18th of January, year 1486, in Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth of York finally wore the crown promised to her. She walked the aisle, robed in white silk, bordered with crimson and gold. Every thread was a message: the white rose of York, the red rose of Lancaster, the royal gold of England. She was 19 years old, a bride, a queen, and, for the first time in years, safe. No one knew what kind of marriage this would be. They were strangers bound by necessity, not affection. A woman of York, trained for courtliness and survival from birth, and a man of exile, hardened by caution, shaped by an ambition he had carried for nearly his entire life. And yet, something gentle began to grow. Henry VII proved not cold nor cruel. He was reserved, yes, cautious, always, but not unkind. He respected Elizabeth, perhaps more than anyone in his court. He listened to her counsel. He trusted her instincts with the nobility the world she had been raised to navigate. She knew the English lords in ways Henry never could. She recognized grudges disguised beneath loyalty, and loyalty hidden under silence. She was not a public partner. She did not challenge him openly, nor stand beside him in council, but she became the quiet force behind the scenes. The one who whispered names, predicted alliances, warned him when smiles rang hollow. Many queens held influence. Elizabeth wielded it with precision, invisible, yet indispensable. Henry was not as dazzling as her father, Edward IV. He was not physically striking, not charming like the kings of old, but he was intelligent, diligent, and cautious in all things, including affection. Theirs was not a grand romance. It was a partnership carved out of history, a bond shaped by mutual reliance and quiet understanding. Henry relied on Elizabeth to legitimize his dynasty. Without her, his claim was only half a claim. Elizabeth relied on Henry to keep her family alive, to end the cycle of blood that had taken everything from her. In that fragile trust, something like intimacy formed. Behind the silk curtains and stone walls, they learned each other's rhythms not as lovers destined by fate, but as two survivors who understood the war was not over. Only the battlefield had changed. She had once been a pawn. Now she was a queen. He had once been a fugitive. Now he rested his kingdom's stability in her hands. And from that quiet alliance, beneath the surface of England's new peace, the the Tudor dynasty began to take root, not with fire, but with whispered decisions and steady, silent strength. In September of year 1486, Elizabeth of York gave birth to her first child, a son, at Winchester. And this was no ordinary royal birth. The baby was named Arthur, deliberately invoking the legendary King Arthur, the mythical leader who, like Henry Tudor, was said to have united a fractured land. The symbolism was unmistakable. The boy was not merely a prince, he was a promise. The heir who carried both the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster in his veins. Arthur's birth was a triumph not just for Elizabeth as a mother, but for the entire Tudor dynasty. A strong marriage, a strong heir, a dynasty rooted, at last, in legitimacy. And in the years that followed, Elizabeth fulfilled her duty with calm, unwavering grace. Over the next 16 years, she would give birth to 6 more children. Asterisk, Princess Margaret, born in the year 1489. Asterisk, Prince Henry, born in the year 1491, eventually Henry VIII. Asterisk, Princess Elizabeth, born in the year 1492, who died in infancy. Asterisk, Princess Mary, born in the year 1496, who would become Queen of France. Asterisk, Prince Edmund, born in the year 1499, who died before his first birthday. Asterisk, and in the year 1503, baby Catherine, who lived only days. Of her 7 children, 4 survived to adulthood. For a queen in the 15th century, that was considered remarkable success. Yet Elizabeth was not merely a vessel for heirs. She reshaped the role of queen consort. She understood what Henry did not. The war was over, but peace needed to be seen. Elizabeth crafted a court of splendor banquets with 50 dishes, coronations threaded with gold, processions of silk and velvet and jeweled horse harnesses. Foreign ambassadors returned home, speaking not only of England's new king, but of its breathtaking queen draped in brocade, her hair bound with pearls, her presence blending regal authority with gentle approachability. Henry ruled with strategy. Elizabeth ruled with presence. She never openly challenged her husband. She did not seek the limelight, but she made herself indispensable. She managed the royal household with precision, ensuring that every visiting noble, every foreign diplomat, every errant rumour was handled with grace. Her court became a theatre where the message was always the same. The war is over, the Tudors are here to stay. England is whole again. But shadows do not vanish on command. In the year 1487, a young boy named Lambert Simnel appeared in Ireland, claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, Elizabeth's cousin. He gathered serious support lords, knights, Irish clans. The rebellion was crushed swiftly, but it revealed a dangerous truth. The Tudor throne still rested on unstable ground. All that was needed to shake it was a boy who looked like a Plantagenet. And then came something far more sinister. Around the year 1490, a handsome, charismatic man appeared in Burgundy. He claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the 2 princes who had vanished in the Tower of London. Elizabeth's brother. He called himself Perkin Warbeck. Warbeck had charm. He had manners. He knew details that could not easily be forged: court gossip, rhythms of speech, mannerisms. And more importantly, kings and queens across Europe believed him. Margaret of Burgundy recognized him as her nephew. James IV of Scotland gave him refuge, and even his cousin in marriage. Suddenly, the question rippled across England. Had Richard truly survived? Was the lost prince alive and ready to reclaim his throne? For Henry, this was a crisis. For Elizabeth, it was something much harder, a wound. Reopened. She said nothing in public. She did not gasp or weep or read his claims in Parliament. But one can imagine her alone, in a silent chamber at Greenwich Palace, staring into the dark with her breath held, thinking, what if? Yet deep inside, she already knew the answer. Richard and Edward, the princes in the Tower, had died in the year 1483. Richard's claim was not truth, it was opportunity, a ghost for powerful men to weaponize. Perkin Warbeck was not her brother. He was the shape of a hope that could never be real. And so, Elizabeth remained silent. She watched as her husband hunted the pretender. She prayed for stability. And somewhere, perhaps in her heart, She mourned the brothers she had lost all over again, not because they had returned, but because it was now irrefutably clear they never would. In the end, to secure his throne once and for all, Henry VII chose ruthlessness. In the year 1499, he ordered the execution of both Perkin Warbeck and Edward, Earl of Warwick, Elizabeth's own cousin, the last male Plantagenet with a true claim to the throne. Politically, it was the logical choice. Emotionally, it was devastation. Perkin Warbeck had spent years posing as Elizabeth's brother, a living wound made of lies. But Edward of Warwick was no impostor. He was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, the uncle who had once been drowned in a vat of wine. He had been imprisoned almost his entire life since childhood, simply because his lineage made him threatening. He was not a rebel. He was not a traitor. He was only dangerous because he existed. And yet, on Henry's orders, he was beheaded. With the deaths of these two men, one pretender, one legitimate heir, the last male branches of the Plantagenet family collapsed forever. The House of York, once glorious, now existed only through Elizabeth, through her marriage, through her sons. This was, in every political sense, victory. But what does victory feel like when it is built on the bones of those who share your blood? Elizabeth must have known this was coming, must have understood that a Tudor king could never sleep safely while a Plantagenet heart still beat in the tower. And yet, knowing did not protect her from the truth. She had married peace into existence, and she was now watching that peace spill blood in her name. What did that do to her? She was a victim of the Plantagenet power game. She had fled sanctuaries, watched her brothers disappear, been used as a pawn to bind kingdoms. And now she was the architect of a new order, one that required the destruction of what remained of her own family. To England, she was the queen who united the roses. To history, she is remembered as the gentle mother figure of the Tudor age. But beneath the silken ceremony, Elizabeth carried a contradiction only she could understand. She was both the survivor and the instrument of the system that consumed her bloodline, and that contradiction shaped everything that came after. It is perhaps here that Elizabeth's psychology grew sharpest. She had seen how power killed innocence in children, in heirs, in loyal cousins and voiceless wives. She had watched her own brothers sacrificed in a tower, her cousins sacrificed at a block, all in the name of legitimacy. She knew, the crown is a blade. Even when it rests lightly, it cuts. And Elizabeth, as a mother, became determined to keep that blade from falling on her children. She raised Prince Arthur and Prince Henry, not just with affection, though she loved them fiercely, but with vigilance. She taught them letters and lineage, yes. Grace and protocol, yes. But she also taught them how to watch a court the way she had watched one, to measure loyalties, to trust no one fully, to see threats in smiles. In those teachings lay necessity and danger, because with every warning, every subtle caution, Elizabeth was planting seeds in her sons. Seeds of vigilance, seeds of fear, seeds of a truth she knew too well. You are only king as long as no one stronger comes for you. Arthur absorbed this with quiet discipline. Henry II's son absorbed it like fire absorbs oil. He grew up believing he was chosen, destined, above betrayal yet defined by the fear of it. He grew up watching his mother's lineage be erased, his father eliminate rivals, his world hang on titles and blood. And years later, when that second son became Henry VIII, the king who executed wives, killed friends, and destroyed monasteries, his armour of suspicion was not forged in adulthood. It was cast long before in the rooms where Elizabeth whispered warnings, and in the silence where she never spoke of the princes who vanished. She did not mean to make a tyrant. She only meant to keep her children alive. But in protecting Prince Henry from betrayal, Elizabeth of York, perhaps without realizing it, taught him that betrayal should be preemptive. That power must be absolute. That fear sustains a kingdom more effectively than love. That blood, once spilled, is sometimes the only language a throne understands, and history would remember him accordingly. In the year 1502, a devastating message arrived at Greenwich Palace. Prince Arthur, just 15 years old, the carefully raised heir of the Tudor dynasty, was dead. The news came from Ludlow Castle, where Arthur had been living with his young wife, Catherine of Aragon. Both had fallen ill with sweating sickness, a plague-like illness that struck swiftly and mercilessly. While Catherine survived after days of fever and delirium, Arthur did not. On the 2nd of April, year 1502, The boy who was supposed to carry the Tudor legacy forward slipped quietly out of the world, leaving behind no heir, no brothers, no future, except grief. When the message reached Henry VII, the king who had conquered England through steel and cunning and iron will, he reportedly broke down, sobbing like a child. The man who had faced armies without flinching could not face the death of his firstborn son. Elizabeth, who knew too well the taste of loss, did what she had always done. She carried one more burden so that others would not collapse under it. She held her husband's hand. She reminded him gently that they still had Prince Henry, 11 years old, clever, charismatic, beloved by the court. They still had their daughters Margaret, Mary, and the little Elizabeth. There might still be time for more children. Her voice was soft, steady. Only when she was alone did she allow herself to shatter. Because Arthur was not just her son, he was the entire purpose of her life's sacrifice. She had married her enemy to end a war. She had endured humiliation that the kingdom might have peace. She had watched relatives die so that her children might reign. And now, the crown had taken her child anyway. Arthur's death changed everything. The carefully laid plans of the Tudor dynasty, the French alliance through Arthur's marriage, the diplomatic balance with Spain, the second generation of unified rule all crumbled in an instant. And suddenly, the future of England rested on the shoulders of a boy who had not been raised to carry it. Henry, the second son. For nearly a decade, Henry had grown in the background, allowed to run, to joust, to hunt, to sing, to learn languages, to flirt and laugh at tournaments. He was the golden boy of the court, handsome, charming, physically gifted, and admired by courtiers who whispered that he looked more like a king than Arthur ever had. But no one had prepared him to rule. That had been Arthur's destiny. And so, in a moment of grief and clarity, Elizabeth of York made a decision that would ultimately change not only her son, but history itself. She would prepare him, personally. She hired the finest tutors in Europe, scholars who had studied Aristotle, Aquinas, Erasmus. Henry learned Latin, French, Greek. He studied theology, statecraft, humanist philosophy. He was trained in music and poetry, wrote verse himself, sang with a remarkable voice, and played harp, lute, and organ. He learned to charm with his words, as well as his presence. Yet what made his education different was not his books, it was his mother. Unlike many queens, Elizabeth did not simply delegate her children to wet nurses and governesses. She spent hours with Henry eating meals beside him, asking questions about his studies, listening to his thoughts on scripture and kingship. She spoke to him as though his destiny were already carved in stone, and over, in subtle phrases and whispered affirmations, she told him, "You were chosen. You are set apart. You are meant to wear the crown." It was not arrogance she meant to instill, but resilience. She wanted him to feel protected, adored, assured in who he was. She had seen what doubt and insecurity could destroy. She would not let it swallow her child. To young Henry, this became the foundation of his identity. His mother was not merely a queen, she was his world. She was the only person whose love required no performance, no victory, no crown. And that love, unconditional, adoring, unwavering, did something profound inside him. It convinced him he deserved everything, not because he had earned it, but because destiny had chosen him. That seed planted gently, lovingly, by a mother who wanted her son to be strong would one day grow into a towering conviction. I am the king, and the king cannot be denied. When that belief meets absolute power, empires tremble. But in those days, there was only a soft-voiced mother, and an 11-year-old boy who adored her the future Henry VIII, sitting at her side, soaking in every word like scripture. And Elizabeth of York, gentle, wise, grieving, could not yet know. She was giving England not only its most famous king, but its most dangerous one. At 36 years old, after 6 pregnancies and the loss of her eldest son, Elizabeth of York became pregnant once more. The Tudor dynasty still desperately needed another male heir, someone to stand beside young Prince Henry, should fate strike a second time. And so, despite the danger, despite her body having been worn down by a decade and a half of childbirth and grief, Elizabeth prepared herself once again to give England a child. It would be her last act of duty. In February of year 1503, Elizabeth of York went into labour inside the Tower of London, the same stone fortress where her two younger brothers had disappeared 20 years earlier. She gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Catherine. The child lived only 9 days, and almost immediately, something went wrong. Elizabeth developed puerperal fever, a deadly postpartum infection that medieval medicine could neither prevent nor cure. For 9 long days, she lay in agony, trapped in the same walls that had haunted her since childhood, screaming for breath, burning with fever, her body slowly shutting down. Her husband, Henry VII, summoned the best physicians in England. They tried herbs, tinctures, prayers, but nothing helped. Her body was losing the battle, and all the while, just outside her chamber doors, a 12-year-old boy listened. Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, pressed his ear against a cold stone wall and heard his mother screaming. Heard her calling out, heard the silence that followed. No one told him what was happening. No one explained why his mother was screaming. No one prepared him for what came next. On the 11th of February, year 1503, her 37th birthday, Elizabeth of York died. The kingdom mourned a queen. Henry VII mourned a partner. But for one boy, standing alone in a dark hallway, the world ended. Elizabeth of York had been the only person who loved Prince Henry completely and unconditionally. Not because he was a prince, not because he might one day be king, but simply because he was her child. She looked at him and saw destiny, but also saw the boy beneath the crown. His father, King Henry VII, was a man of wariness and restraint, a ruler always preparing for betrayal. He loved his children, but cautiously, leaving them at arm's length. Elizabeth's love was different. It was warm, unconditional, constant. She sat with Henry while he practiced Latin. She listened to his music. She told him he was chosen. She made him feel seen. And now she was gone. There was no explanation, no farewell, no one to say that her love had not been a dream. For the rest of his life, Henry VIII would carry that moment inside him, the scream, and then the silence. That was the origin of the wound that never healed. One day he was a boy, adored by the gentlest force he had ever known. The next day, he was the heir to a throne that so often had demanded its heirs be sacrificed. Psychologists, centuries later, would call it attachment disruption, the sudden shattering of emotional safety. A cut so deep it bleeds into adulthood. At 12 years old, Henry learned that love could vanish without warning, that even queens, even mothers, could disappear without reason. And so he spent the rest of his life trying to recreate it. Not just affection, not just loyalty, absolute unconditional devotion, the kind his mother gave him. He searched for it in every woman he married, and when they failed to provide it, the way only a mother can, they were discarded, broken, beheaded, replaced. His wives were never just partners. They were substitutes for what was taken from him in that tower room, the feeling of being adored without limits, without conditions. But none of them could ever give him what he lost. They were queens, bound by alliances, politics, religion, and the relentless ticking of time, urging them to give England a son. Elizabeth's love had no such conditions. And so, Henry demanded the impossible and punished the world for not giving it back. All because one night, in a dark stone fortress, a little boy pressed his ear to a wall and heard the only voice that ever soothed him, screaming in pain. Then silence. Forever. Elizabeth's death changed Henry VII forever. Once cautious but warm in private, the king retreated into something colder, an emotional winter that never thawed. He became distant, rigid, consumed by suspicion and governed increasingly by fear. His policy sharpened like a knife. He hoarded wealth obsessively, levied harsh fines, imposed crushing taxes, and used the legal system to contain and punish any noble who might threaten his fragile dynasty. The warmth Elizabeth had brought into the Tudor court vanished. Ceremonies continued, the feasts, the pageantry, the jewels, but something living had gone. The corridors felt hollow, the laughter muted. The Queen's presence, once the quiet flame that softened stone and tempers alike, was extinguished. Henry VII withdrew. He spent more time alone, even from his children, especially from his son. Prince Henry, 12 years old, newly declared heir, was not allowed the luxury of grief. The machinery of kingship did not stop for sorrow, yet the boy found his own escape: movement. He rode horses for hours. He hunted until exhaustion. He fenced in the courtyard, danced in the great halls, played lute and organ until his fingers ached, anything that made his muscles burn enough to dull the weight in his chest. And every night, when the palace was quiet, when every echo of celebration stilled, he cried for his mother. Elizabeth of York did not simply fade from his memory, she expanded inside it. She became his ideal of womanhood, the elegant queen who stood beside her husband with grace, the gentle mother who never raised her voice, the warm presence who loved without condition, without question. She became perfect, not because she was, but because she died before she ever disappointed him. Psychologists, centuries later, would call this maternal idealization, when a child freezes a lost parent in perfection because it's too painful to remember them as flawed. Henry did not understand that this was untrue. What he understood was simply this: my mother loved me completely. No one else ever has. When he became Henry VIII, that wound disguised as memory began directing his life. He looked at his wives, not as partners, but as replacements. Catherine of Aragon, patient, devoted, regal, came closest to his mother in grace and loyalty, but she failed to give him a son. And the moment she failed her duty, the memory of Elizabeth's perfect devotion turned against her. Catherine's realness, her exhaustion, her protest made her unworthy. Anne Boleyn was the opposite, fiery, brilliant, alive. But Henry wanted her to become another Elizabeth the moment she became queen. When she did not bow, when she argued, when she miscarried, the wound spoke again. She is not her. He felt betrayed, not just as a king, but as the child who once lost love without warning. Jane Seymour was praised because she was quiet, obedient, soft-spoken. She seemed to match the myth of Elizabeth more than the others. And when she gave him a son, Henry mourned her sincerely, almost reverently, as though she had finally fulfilled the ache he had been trying to soothe all his life. But every queen after Jane faced the same impossible demand: love me like she did. Never fail, never question, never leave. And each time a woman could not, because no woman could, Henry felt again the deep, primal wound of that night in the Tower when the only person who had ever told him yes died behind a door he was not allowed to open. This was not only the story of broken marriages. It was the story of an unhealed boy ruling with the power of a god, slaughtering anyone who dared to remind him that love can end. So when we speak of the blood-soaked marriages of Henry VIII, the divorces, the beheadings, the humiliations, we often blame power, ego, and tyranny. But underneath it all lies the moment a boy pressed his ear to a wall and learned that love can vanish in screams and silence, and that the world does not care. Elizabeth's death was not just the end of a queen's life. It was the beginning of a dynasty's curse, and the quiet spark that ignited one of the most tragic reigns in English history. Elizabeth was laid to rest at Windsor, beside her father, King Edward IV, in a quiet stone tomb far simpler than the grand marble monument Henry VII would later build for them both. Even in death, her choice was modest, almost private. She did not demand a spectacle. She did not claim her place by force. Elizabeth slipped back into the earth as she had once lived, with grace, restraint, and a silent eye on the future. And yet, her true monument was never carved in stone. It lived in the architecture of a dynasty forged by her marriage, in the quiet psychology of a wounded boy who would become a king in the shape of a flower. The red and white Tudor rose, symbol of unity, was born from her blood. Because Elizabeth of York was more than a queen. She was the knot that tied two warring houses together, Lancaster red, York white. Her union with Henry Tudor brought an end to the War of the Roses, a conflict that had bled England for 3 decades. It was her name, not her husband's, that soothed the old fear. Are we ruled by a rightful king? Because while Henry conquered the crown at Bosworth, Elizabeth validated it, and her legacy did not end at her own generation. Her daughter Margaret Tudor married King James IV of Scotland, a union that would, a century later, place a Scottish king on the English throne and unite 2 nations whose borders had been soaked in blood for centuries. Her son, Henry VIII, brutal as he was, dragged England into the modern age, breaking from Rome, reforming the church, seizing monastic wealth, and redefining kingship itself. Her granddaughter Mary, through Margaret's line, bore a son named James, who would become James I of England. Her great-granddaughter, named for her, ruled for 45 years. Elizabeth I, the Golden Age Queen, a monarch whose very name echoes like a second birth of her grandmother's spirit. Elizabeth of York stands quietly behind every crown that followed. She is the hinge, the bridge, the silent architect of a dynasty that outlived the men who wielded its sword. But perhaps her most haunting legacy is not political. It is psychological. Elizabeth raised her son Henry with a fierce conviction that he was chosen, sacred, favored by destiny. She wrapped him in affection, in validation, in an unbreakable belief that he was special. But in doing so, she raised a boy who never learned how to hear no. She died before he ever learned that love can coexist with limits that trust can survive. Disappointment that devotion is not the same as obedience. That was the wound. That was the tragedy. Elizabeth taught her son that power was his birthright and loved him deeply enough to make him believe he deserved everything. But by leaving him too soon, she left him chasing the ghost of her love forever. His 6 queens were not merely political pawns. They were impossible substitutes in a lifelong quest to rebuild the safety of childhood. They were punished not just for failing a king, but for failing to be her. And so we return to the final question, one that historians still whisper about. As Henry VII threw her kin into the Tower, as he executed Edward, Earl of Warwick, Elizabeth's own cousin, to secure the dynasty, as bodies were silenced in the name of Tudor survival, did Elizabeth stay silent because she feared her husband? Or because she loved him? Or did she understand that in the brutal algebra of monarchy, love comes second to survival? Was she complicit or resigned? Was her smile a shield or a strategy? We will never know. But perhaps that is why she haunts us. Not because she was loud, but because she was silent in precisely the places where we long for answers. Elizabeth of York is a paradox. A woman who healed a war by sacrificing her own bloodline. A mother whose love shaped a king yet doomed his wives. A queen whose greatest achievement died the moment she did. She was the rose that stopped the swords, but left sharp thorns in the hands of everyone who held her memory. And that may be why we still whisper her name, quietly, uncertainly, as though she's still here, watching to see what her sacrifice was truly worth. And now, let's take a breath together. We've walked through centuries of stone corridors, heard the echoes of armored boots and whispered vows in the dark. But as the last candle flickers low, and the noise of courtly intrigue fades away, all that remains is a stillness. If you close your eyes, you might still see her. Elizabeth of York, quiet, poised, standing between war and peace. Her life reminds us that sometimes the greatest power lies not in the crown we wear, but in the choices we make silently, when no one is watching. That love can shape kingdoms, even if it doesn't save us. That the tenderness we give can echo across generations, even if history never shouts our names. Some stories end in triumph, others in tragedy. But this one rests gently between the two, like a rose lying atop a stone tomb. And now, let it go. Let the walls of Windsor grow soft and distant. Let the voices fade into velvet silence. Let this history become a quiet dream. Thank you, dear listener, for being here tonight. May your rest be light and your mind at ease. If this story moved you, I hope you will subscribe so we can meet again beneath the calm glow of another gentle tale. Sleep well, and good night.